Marjorie Blake stood at my fence line in a pink suit, pointing at my grandfather's trees like they were weeds. Behind her, chainsaws screamed through 80 years of family history. I was 40 miles away when my son called and said, "Dad, they're cutting everything down." By the time I got home, the lake view she wanted was wide open, and my land looked like a crime scene. Subscribe, because what she didn't know was that those trees were never hers to touch. The first tree hit the ground so hard that every window on the east side of Silver Pine Shores went silent. A woman in a pink suit stood at my fence line with one hand lifted, not waving, not warning, just pointing at the next tree like she was ordering a waiter to clear a plate. Behind her, a chainsaw bit into my grandfather's white oak, and nobody on that hillside moved to stop it. I was 40 miles away in Bend, standing in the dusty parking lot of a farm supply store with an irrigation pump coupling in one hand and a receipt clenched between my teeth. The afternoon sun was sharp enough to bleach the mountains pale blue, and the wind carried the dry smell of asphalt, diesel, and hot metal. My name is Ethan Cole Mercer. I'm 52 years old, built more by work than by choice, with short brown hair, a hard jaw, and the kind of face people stop joking around when they look at too long. That day I had on my red and black flannel over a tight gray shirt, blue jeans stiff with dust, brown leather boots, and the old wristwatch my father gave me when I took over Mercer Ridge Farm. I was thinking about water pressure, not war. Then my phone rang. Caleb's name came up on the screen, and before I could say hello, I heard wind, engines, and something in my son's breathing I had never heard before. He was 23, a forestry kid with more patience than I had at his age, the kind of young man who checked data twice before he stepped into a fight. But his voice came through thin and tight, like he was holding a door shut against a storm. "Dad," he said, "they're cutting everything down." For half a second, my mind refused to understand the words. I looked past my truck at a woman loading bags of feed into a minivan, at a crow walking along the roofline of the store, at the brown hills beyond the road. The world kept moving in small, ordinary pieces, while my son told me there were 6 men on our western boundary, 2 trucks, a chipper, a flatbed, and Marjorie Blake standing there in her pink suit giving orders. He said the first dozen trees were already gone. He said they had papers. He said Grandpa Walter was on the porch watching. That was the part that put ice in my blood. I threw the pump coupling into the passenger seat, climbed into my truck, and drove out of Bend like the road owed me time. The old Ford shook past the outskirts, past sagebrush flats and dry creek beds, past the places where tourists slowed down to photograph a sky I had stopped noticing years ago. My hands stayed locked on the wheel. I did not call Marjorie. I did not call the sheriff, yet. I called Caleb back and told him to record everything, every truck, every face, every stump, every inch of the line. I told him not to touch anybody. I told him to get Walter inside. He did not answer right away. Through the phone I heard the rising whine of another saw, the crack of a trunk giving way, then the heavy, final crash of something old being forced to become horizontal. When Caleb came back, his voice was lower. "He won't go inside," he said. "He just keeps staring." The last 10 miles to the farm run along Lake Astor, where the water opens suddenly between the pines and makes rich people think God personally designed the view for their dining rooms. Silver Pine Shores sat above that water in clean angles and glass railings, all stone driveways, black roofs, and outdoor fireplaces nobody needed. Our farm lay below it, rougher and older, 160 acres of pasture, seed fields, irrigation lines, rusting gates, and a farmhouse my grandfather, Samuel Mercer, built after the war, with borrowed tools and hands that shook when thunder rolled in. The tree line along the western boundary was the first thing he planted. Ponderosa pine, cottonwood, Oregon white oak. 48 trees, spaced by eye, grown into a living wall that held the wind, held the soil, and held more family history than any courthouse record ever could. When I turned onto our gravel drive, I saw the lake first. That was wrong. For as long as I'd been alive, You could only catch pieces of it through the branches, silver flashes between trunks, light broken by leaves. Now the whole lake lay exposed, wide and blue and obscene, shining behind a battlefield of stumps. My truck rolled to a stop. Dust drifted past the windshield. The chainsaws were quiet now, and somehow that was worse. The air smelled like raw sap, gasoline, and fresh death. Caleb stood near the barn with a drone controller hanging from a strap around his neck. His face was pale under his work cap, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Above us, the drone hovered with its small red light blinking, still filming the destruction before anyone could clean it up and call it a misunderstanding. I wanted to ask why he had not stopped them. I wanted to ask why he had stood there with a camera while our family's trees came down. Then I looked at the 6 workers near the flatbed, at the chainsaws, at the trucks, at the HOA people watching from the hill, and I understood before he said it. If Caleb had charged in, they would have made him the threat. So he had made himself the witness. Across the property line, Marjorie Blake stood on the manicured side of the fence like she had just won an election. She was 40 years old, pale, polished, with short white hair cut to her shoulders, and a tailored pink suit that looked untouched by dust. In one hand she held a slim folder, in the other a champagne flute. She did not look guilty. She looked pleased. Behind her, several Silverpine residents watched from patios and balconies, their faces half hidden by glass and distance. One of them, Maya Chen, a quiet woman I recognized from the mailbox turn-off, stood beside a cedar privacy screen with her phone lifted low against her chest. Her thumb moved once over the screen, as if she was deciding whether to save what she had seen or erase it to protect herself. I stepped out of the truck and walked the line. I counted without meaning to. Stump after stump, pale circles in the torn ground, each one bleeding sap into the sawdust. The cottonwood where Caleb broke his wrist at 10 was gone. The pine my mother photographed every Christmas was gone. Then I reached the 7th white oak from the north end and stopped. My father had carved my mother's initials there when they were 16, before Vietnam took his brother, before drought took half the herd, before age took the strength out of his hands. The trunk lay in pieces now, the carved heart split open and dragged into the dirt. Walter Mercer sat on the front steps of the old farmhouse, 78 years old, shoulders bent under a brown work jacket, hands resting on his knees. His face was still but not calm. It was the look of a man watching someone tear pages out of the only Bible his father ever owned. Nora stood behind him in the doorway, one hand over her mouth, her teacher's eyes wet and furious. No one spoke until Marjorie opened the gate without asking and walked just far enough onto my land to make sure I saw the folder in her hand. She said the HOA had a view corridor easement from 2012. She said the trees interfered with lake visibility. She said Silverpine Shores had exercised its maintenance rights after years of my family's refusal to cooperate. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, almost bored. She held out the document like a royal decree. I did not take it, because my grandfather's will was locked in a fireproof box in our hallway closet, and I knew what it said. That boundary strip could never be sold, transferred, or surrendered to anyone outside the Mercer bloodline. Not for a road, not for a view, not for a woman in a pink suit who thought paper could make theft look civilized. That night, we sat in the kitchen while the dark pressed against the windows where the trees used to be. Nora made coffee no one drank. Caleb's drone footage played silently on his laptop, showing Marjorie pointing, the workers cutting, the lake opening wider with every falling trunk. Walter sat at the end of the table, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that we all leaned toward it. "Don't do anything that makes you ashamed," he said. "But don't let them think this family has nobody left standing." I looked out past the black glass of the window, toward the empty line, toward the luxury homes glowing above the lake. And for the first time since the phone call, my anger went cold enough to become useful. "If they wanted a view," I said, "I'll give them something to look at." By sunrise, the stumps were smoking in the cold. Not from fire, not from heat, but from the thin, white breath of morning lifting off raw wood, where 48 living things had been cut open less than 20 hours before. Then, a white Cadillac rolled up my gravel drive like it owned the dust, and Marjorie Blake stepped out in that same pink suit, clean as a fresh wound. She brought witnesses. 2 HOA board members climbed out behind her, both dressed for a meeting, not a crime scene. One was a narrow-shouldered man with silver glasses and a leather folder hugged to his chest like a shield. The other was a woman in a cream coat who kept glancing at the stumps and then away again, as if looking too long might make her responsible. Marjorie did not glance away. Her white hair sat smooth against her jaw, her lipstick was perfect, and her smile had the dead calm of someone who had practiced it in a mirror before coming to ruin a family's morning. I was on the porch before she reached the steps. I had not slept. My red and black flannel still smelled like sawdust and gasoline, and there was a piece of white oak bark in my shirt pocket that I had picked up before dawn without knowing why. Caleb stood near the barn with his drone case open at his feet, dark circles under his eyes, his anger packed so tight he barely moved. Nora was behind the screen door, silent, watching everything with the stillness she used in her classroom when a student was about to lie badly. Walter sat in the old wooden chair near the porch rail, wrapped in his brown jacket, his hands folded over the head of his cane. He looked smaller in the morning light, and that made something in me want to break. Marjorie stopped at the bottom step and lifted a cream-colored folder. She did not ask if she could come closer. She did not look at my father. She looked at me, because people like her always choose the person they think can be made angry enough to look guilty. She said the words slowly, cleanly, like she was reading them off the inside of her eyelids. The Silver Pine Shores Homeowners Association had acted within its recorded rights under a view corridor easement executed in 2012. The trees had constituted an unreasonable obstruction to lake visibility. The maintenance action had been unfortunate, but lawful. If the Mercer family wished to dispute it, the proper venue was civil court. Civil court. She said it like a locked gate. Then she opened the folder and held out a 2-page document with a county stamp, a legal description, and a signature at the bottom that made the porch go colder than the morning air. Walter Mercer. My father's name, shaped in black ink by a hand that had tried to imitate his, but did not know him. Walter leaned forward, and for the first time since the trees came down, his face changed. It was not grief anymore. It was insult. It was the look of an old man seeing a stranger wear his dead wife's wedding ring. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He looked at the paper and said, "That is not my signature." For one brief second, the woman in the cream coat stopped breathing. The man with the silver glasses lowered his eyes. Marjorie's smile stayed exactly where it was. That was the first moment I understood this had not gone wrong by accident. Her face did not flicker with surprise. She had expected the denial. She had prepared for it. She shifted the folder against her hip and said that recorded documents carried legal weight whether or not a party later regretted signing them. She said quiet title actions were expensive. She said handwriting experts took time. She said farmers often underestimated the cost of litigation against organized communities. There it was, the blade under the silk. She thought I was a man with a temper, a mortgage, a grieving father, and no stomach for lawyers. She thought the stumps would sit there while her new lake view made 7 houses worth more money. She thought the longer the case dragged on, the more the cup trees would become yesterday's problem. I looked past her shoulder at Silver Pine Shores, where curtains moved in tall windows and faces vanished behind glass. Somewhere up there, Maya Chen was watching too. I could see the shadow of her on her balcony, phone in one hand, body half hidden behind a cedar privacy wall, like a woman caught between fear and conscience. I let Marjorie talk until she finished burying herself. When she finally stopped, I took one step down and told her to leave the document on the porch rail. I did not touch her hand. I did not touch the folder. I did not give her the scene she had come hoping to collect. The disappointment in her eyes was small, but it was there. Caleb saw it too. His fingers tightened around the edge of the drone case, and I realized he was learning the same lesson I had learned too late in life. Sometimes rage is useful only after you teach it to sit still. Marjorie placed the paper on the rail, turned with a faint smile, and walked back to her Cadillac. Before she opened the door, she looked across the stump line toward the lake, toward the clean blue prize she had taken. And for the first time that morning, she looked satisfied. The Cadillac reversed slowly, tires grinding over gravel, then rolled back up toward Silverpine Shores with the two board members trapped inside, like passengers who had just realized the driver might be drunk. The moment she was gone, the porch changed. Caleb started pacing. Nora reached for the document but stopped before touching it, then went inside and came back with latex gloves from the school science kit she kept for field trips. That was Nora, practical even when the sky was falling. She slid the easement into a plastic sleeve and carried it to the kitchen table like evidence from a murder scene. Walter followed slowly, each step of his cane on the floorboards sounding heavier than the last. I called June. My daughter answered from Portland on the fourth ring, her voice sharp with traffic and office air. June Mercer had spent half her life running from this farm, and the other half pretending that leaving had not cost her anything. She was 27, a new attorney with polished shoes, fast words, and her mother's eyes when she was angry. I told her what Marjorie had brought. I sent photos of the document. I sent Caleb's drone stills. I sent a picture of Walter looking at the forged signature, though I almost did not, because some kinds of pain feel indecent to share. June went quiet for a long time. By noon, she was on the road. While we waited, Nora disappeared into the back room and opened the old metal filing cabinet where she kept 30 years of lesson plans, soil surveys, bird count sheets, and student projects tied with rubber bands. She came back dust-streaked and pale, carrying a folder labeled Mercer Windbreak Habitat Study, 2009. Inside were printed photographs of our tree line in spring, green and alive, with student handwriting in the margins. One photo showed a nest tucked high in the fork of a white oak. Nora laid her finger beside it, but did not touch the image. The bird had been federally protected. The habitat notes had been submitted to a conservation education program tied to county records. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said the trees were not just family history. They had been habitat. An hour later, a dented green pickup pulled into the drive and stopped far from the house, like the man inside was afraid to come closer. Sam Rodriguez stepped out with his cap in his hands. He was the owner of the cutting crew, a broad man in his late 50s, with sawdust still trapped in the seams of his jacket and shame sitting plainly on his face. He did not ask to come inside. He stood beside the first stump and told me Marjorie had given him a survey. She had given him the easement. She had told him the Mercer family had been notified and refused to cooperate. When his crew questioned the line, she told them to keep cutting. Sam's voice cracked once, and he looked at Walter when he said he would swear to every word. June arrived just before dark. Her black sedan came too fast down the gravel, throwing dust against the empty line where trees should have caught it. She stepped out in a navy coat, city shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt, her hair pulled back, her face set hard until she saw Walter. Then all the lawyer drained out of her for 1 second, and she became my little girl again, staring at her grandfather surrounded by stumps. She walked the line without speaking. At the 7th white oak, she saw me bend down and pick up another piece of bark, the one with the edge of my mother's carved initial still visible. I put it in my pocket. June looked away fast, but not before I saw her eyes shine. Inside, under the yellow kitchen light, June opened her laptop. Caleb connected the drone footage. Nora spread out the bird habitat files. Sam's written statement sat beside the fake easement. Walter's old driver's license, his farm loan papers, and 3 signed birthday cards were laid out for comparison. The kitchen that had held birthdays, funerals, homework, and tax panic now looked like a war room. Then June found the first crack. The 2012 easement had been filed at the county recorder's office by Derek Blake, Marjorie's husband. At the time, Derek had been the real estate broker marketing the highest-priced Lakeview lots in Silver Pine Shores, and his commission structure rewarded every increase in view value. June turned the laptop toward us. Her face had gone still in that dangerous way lawyers get when anger becomes evidence. She tapped the screen once and said this was not a neighbor dispute anymore. It was forgery, trespass, property destruction, and maybe interference with a protected habitat record. Then she looked at the folder Nora had brought, the drone footage frozen on Marjorie pointing at the trees, and the fake signature at the bottom of the easement. I asked if we were going to sue. June leaned back in my kitchen chair, the same chair she had sat in as a child with mud on her knees and a spelling book open in front of her. For the first time in years, she looked like she belonged in that room. "No," she said quietly. "First, we let them get confident." The man from the federal office arrived in a mud-colored government truck before the frost had melted off the stumps. He did not park near the house, did not shake hands first, did not ask where the property line was. He stepped out with a clipboard, a field vest, and a face that went quiet the moment he saw the open lake where 48 trees were supposed to be. His name was Warren Ellis, a conservation specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and he moved through the damage like a doctor walking into an operating room after everyone else had left. He was a lean man in his 60s with sun-browned skin, gray hair tucked under a canvas cap, and boots that had seen more farms than courtrooms. June had called him at dawn after finding an old conservation file number in Nora's habitat folder, and by 8:30 he was standing on Mercer land, staring at the raw white circles of cut oak and pine with his jaw set so hard I heard his teeth click once in the cold. Caleb and I walked behind him with marking flags. The air was sharp and still, and every sound carried too far. A crow landed on one of the severed cottonwood limbs, hopped twice, then flew off as if even the bird knew the place had become wrong. Warren knelt at the 7th white oak, brushed sawdust away from the stump rings, and laid a measuring tape across the cut face. The tape stretched wider than my arm. He counted with one gloved finger, slow and careful, then stopped before he reached the center. He looked toward the lake, toward the slope of expensive homes glittering in the morning sun, and the silence around him became the kind of silence that makes other men stop talking. That was when I understood this was bigger than a property fight. Warren opened an old digital map on his tablet and turned it so June could see. The blue boundary line ran along our western edge, then curved slightly with the old tree row, exactly where my grandfather Samuel Mercer had planted after the flood of 1974 tore 3 acres of topsoil into Lake Astor. According to the file, that strip had been registered as a conservation buffer, meant to hold the bank, filter runoff, protect the seed fields, and preserve bird habitat along the lake corridor. It was not decorative. It was not abandoned. It had been inspected, photographed, and renewed through federal conservation records for decades, first by my grandfather, then by Walter, and finally by me, without ever thinking the paperwork might one day matter more than the trees themselves. Warren's voice stayed low, but every word landed like a hammer. Several of the Oregon white oaks were over 80 years old. 2 ponderosa pines had been habitat markers. The row was part of a documented riparian buffer tied to federal conservation obligations. The cutting would trigger an investigation, and because the trees had been removed without landowner consent, the case could move beyond civil damages into federal program interference. June stood beside him with her arms folded, city coat buttoned tight against the wind. But I saw her eyes change. The farm she had once seen as mud and debt had become a crime scene with a federal case number. By mid-morning, Deputy Sheriff Aaron Pike arrived with 2 county officers and a camera kit. Pike was broad, quiet, and built like a man who had spent his youth splitting firewood before breakfast. He wore his tan uniform without theater, his hat pulled low, his eyes taking in the stumps, the truck tracks, the gouges where the flatbed had turned too hard in wet soil. He listened to Sam Rodriguez's statement first. Sam stood with his cap twisted in both hands, shoulders hunched under the weight of what his crew had done. He gave Pike the printed work order, the copy of the easement, and the survey Marjorie had handed him. Then he gave him the text messages where Marjorie told him to continue cutting even after he questioned the line. Pike read those messages without expression. Then he looked up toward Silverpine Shores. That hill had never looked so exposed. While the officers photographed the site, Caleb launched the drone again. I'd planned to tell him to leave it alone, but he moved with such focus that the words never came out. The drone rose above us, a small dark shape against the pale sky, and on his tablet, the destruction became geometry. Every stump, every tire track, every dragged branch path, every point where the machines crossed from HOA land onto ours appeared in clean overhead lines. Caleb proposed building a full 3-dimensional map before the ground was disturbed by rain. He said it calmly, like he was solving a forestry lab assignment, but his hands shook when he zoomed in on the 7th oak. For years I'd mistaken his caution for softness. Standing there in the cold, watching him turn grief into evidence, I felt the shame of that settle under my ribs. Near noon, Nora came out of the house with a woman I had not expected to see on our side of the fence. Maya Chen walked beside her, small and tense in a dark green coat, her black hair pulled into a low knot, a camera bag hugged against her chest. She looked like someone crossing a frozen lake she did not trust. Her eyes kept flicking toward the hill, toward the balconies and windows where Silverpine residents watched from behind curtains. When she reached me, she did not offer excuses. She only opened her palm and showed Nora a tiny memory card sealed in a plastic sleeve. Maya had filmed Marjorie the day before. Not from far away, not blurry. Clear enough to see the pink suit, the champagne flute, the way Marjorie pointed from tree to tree while Sam's crew waited for instruction. Clear enough to hear her voice over the chainsaws when she said to take all of them down. Maya's face tightened as Nora loaded the footage on Caleb's laptop in the bed of the truck. She admitted Marjorie had fined her $1,200 the previous year for letting native wildflowers grow too high along her walkway. She said Marjorie called it visual disorder. She said everyone in Silverpine knew what happened to people who crossed her. Then Maya looked at Walter sitting on the porch, small against the farmhouse, watching strangers catalog the remains of his father's trees. Something broke open in her expression. She said she had almost deleted the footage. She said she was ashamed that fear had made her hesitate. Nora took her hand before I could say anything, and Maya began to cry without making a sound. The day kept tightening after that. June worked from the kitchen table with 2 laptops, a legal pad, and the kind of stillness that made me afraid to interrupt her. By late afternoon, she had found Cascade View Management LLC, a landscaping and vegetation compliance company listed in years of Silverpine Shores HOA budgets. The registered address traced to a mailbox in Redmond. The manager of record was Derek Blake. Payments from the HOA had gone out every quarter for years, even though no one could find proof the company had done real work. June followed public filings, county records, and old board meeting summaries until the pattern became too clean to ignore. HOA money went to Derek's company. Derek's company reported view maintenance. Marjorie enforced the view. And now my grandfather's trees were gone. At 4:30, Pike returned from Silverpine with a search warrant request already in progress. He had collected copies of emails from an HOA board account, and June read one over his shoulder before he slipped it into an evidence folder. It was from Derek to Marjorie, sent 3 days before the cutting. The sentence was short, almost casual, and it made the entire kitchen go silent. Once the trees are gone, no one can put the view back. Walter closed his eyes when June read it aloud. Caleb walked out the back door and stood in the yard with both hands on top of his head. Nora covered her mouth, not in shock, but to hold herself together. I stared at that printed line until the words stopped looking like words. They had known. They had planned around the permanence of damage. They had counted on grief being less powerful than money. Just before sunset, Deputy Pike drove up the hill to notify Marjorie that the tree line was part of a federal conservation record. We watched from the farm as his patrol vehicle stopped outside her glass front house. Through the bare space where our trees had stood, we could see everything now. We saw Marjorie open the door in another perfect outfit, pale pink against the golden light. We saw her arms fold. We saw her chin lift. Pike spoke for less than 2 minutes before her face hardened into something uglier than anger. Later, Pike told me what she said. Those trees had reduced the property values of 70 homes. And Pike, God bless him, looked at her standing in the lake view she had stolen and told her property values were not a license to break federal law. That night, after the officers left and the farm fell dark, Caleb's drone map rendered on the kitchen laptop in blue and white points of light. The screen showed our land from above, stripped open, measured, undeniable. June stood behind my chair, one hand on the backrest. Nora sat beside Walter. No one celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate yet. Then the sheriff's department email chimed on June's laptop. A new file had come through from the county recorder's office. It was a scan of the original 2012 easement intake sheet, the one Marjorie said proved everything was legal. June opened it, leaned closer, and her face went colder than I had ever seen it. At the bottom of the intake form was the name of the person who had personally filed the fake easement. Not Derek Blake. Marjorie herself. The first concrete truck arrived before the sun cleared the ridge, its headlights sliding across the stumps like searchlights over a body. By 6:30, 3 men were standing where my grandfather's trees used to be, driving orange stakes into the frost-hardened ground. Up on the hill, Silver Pine Shores began waking one window at a time, and every one of those windows now had a perfect view of what was coming. I stood beside the boundary line with a rolled permit in my hand and mud on my boots, watching the survey crew mark the exact footprint of a 3-story seed-drying barn. Not a decorative shed, not a wall, not some childish monument to anger. A real agricultural structure with a concrete floor, reinforced posts, a drying loft, storage bays for grass seed and barley, and a silver metal roof tall enough to catch the western light. We needed it. We had needed it for years. The only thing new was the location. June had spent 2 days making sure there was not a single weak seam in the paperwork. Agricultural zoning, farm use exemption, county setbacks, drainage plan, structural drawings, equipment list, projected harvest storage, even a note about replacing the lost windbreak's role in reducing soil exposure. She looked like she had not slept since she got home from Portland, but her eyes were clear, and every time a truck rolled in, she checked another document like she was loading a rifle, 1 round at a time. If Marjorie wanted to hide behind recorded paper, June was going to bury her under real paper. The foundation crew moved fast. Gravel went down first, then rebar, then framing. The wet concrete slid from the chute in a heavy gray ribbon, spreading over ground that still held the smell of cut oak. Walter came out just as the first section was poured. He wore his brown jacket, his old cap, and the same boots he had worn to my mother's funeral. He leaned on his cane near the porch until I walked over and offered him my arm, but he shook his head. He wanted to cross the yard himself. Every step looked like it cost him something. Every step made Caleb stop pretending not to worry. By noon, half of Silver Pine Shores had gathered behind their side of the fence. They did not come close. They stood in small, expensive clusters on trimmed lawns and stone paths, holding coffee cups, phones, and the kind of expressions people wear when they are trying to decide whether they are watching justice or vandalism. Marjorie Blake appeared last. Pink suit again, sharper than before, white hair tucked behind one ear, sunglasses hiding her eyes even though the morning had gone cloudy. Derek stood behind her in a navy quilted vest, handsome in a manufactured way, his jaw tight, his arms folded. For the first time since this started, neither of them looked pleased. Marjorie did not cross the fence this time. She used her phone. Within an hour, Maya Chen texted Nora a screenshot from the Silverpine HOA page. Marjorie had called an emergency community meeting for that evening, describing my barn as an aggressive visual obstruction, and me as a threat to collective property values. The phrase was so polished it almost made me laugh. Almost. Then Maya sent the second screenshot, and the humor disappeared. Marjorie had warned residents not to communicate with the Mercer family, claiming there was an active legal threat and that any cooperation could damage the neighborhood's position. But the comments under her post were different now. People were asking about Cascade View management. People were asking why HOA dues had gone up 4 years in a row for vegetation maintenance that no one remembered seeing. People were asking why Marjorie had ordered trees cut before a court confirmed the easement. One resident wrote that if the trees were really protected, the board owed everyone an explanation before another dollar was spent defending the Blakes. That comment had 32 likes before Marjorie deleted it. By mid-afternoon, Maya's little group had a name: Silverpine for Transparency. It had started with 5 residents in a private text thread, the kind of quiet rebellion that usually dies before it reaches daylight. By the time the concrete trucks pulled away, there were 31 households asking for the HOA's financial records. Maya sent Nora one final message with only 3 words: "They are scared." So was I, though not of Marjorie. I was scared of the way Walter's hands trembled when he lowered himself onto the porch step. I was scared of the gray color that came into his face after walking the yard. I was scared he was holding himself together only long enough to see us answer what had been done. He had not asked about doctors. He had not complained. He had simply watched the foundation take shape with wet eyes and a mouth pressed thin, as if the barn were not a building, but a promise being poured into the earth. Caleb spent the afternoon on the far side of the site with Olivia Hart, Sam Rodriguez's niece. She was 25, an engineer with a sun-browned face, dark blonde hair tucked under a yellow hard hat, and a habit of looking at machines like they owed her honesty. Sam had sent her over to help Caleb set up erosion monitoring after the tree line loss, and within 10 minutes, the two of them were speaking a language of drones, slope angles, water flow, and sensor grids that made me feel older than I wanted to admit. They placed temporary stakes along the exposed ground, mapped runoff channels, and argued quietly over where to put the first soil moisture reader. Caleb smiled once when Olivia corrected his math. It was small, quick, and gone almost immediately. But Nora saw it from the porch and gave me a look that said the world might still be turning. The first wall frame went up 2 days later. It rose slowly from the foundation, dark beams against a pale Oregon sky, while the lake flashed behind it in pieces. Men climbed ladders. Nail guns cracked. The air filled with sawdust again, but this time it was clean lumber, not murdered trees. Caleb's solar plans were taped to the hood of his truck, weighted with a wrench. Nora had already ordered native vine starts for the future green wall. Honeysuckle, clematis, wild grape. Anything that could soften the metal and give birds somewhere to return. The barn was becoming something none of us had expected. It was born from anger, yes, but every hand that touched it turned that anger into work. Marjorie's emergency meeting happened that night in the Silverpine clubhouse, and we did not attend. We did not need to. Maya sent notes in bursts. Marjorie stood at the front under recessed lighting and called the barn an act of rural hostility. Derek warned that home values could fall if the HOA did not respond aggressively. Then a retired accountant named Paul Brenner stood up and asked why Cascade View Management had received over $200,000 in maintenance payments, while the HOA had no invoices with crew names, job photos, or completion reports. Someone else asked whether Derek's company had a conflict of interest. Someone asked why the police had taken HOA emails. Someone asked if Marjorie had known the trees were protected before ordering them cut. That was the comment that made the room erupt. By the time the meeting ended, Marjorie had lost control of the people she had spent years teaching to be afraid of her. Not all of them, not even most yet, but enough. Enough for her to feel the floor shift. The roof panels arrived on the 5th day. They were long sheets of silver metal stacked on a flatbed, bright even under clouds. The crew waited until afternoon when the wind dropped, then lifted them one by one into place. Each panel caught the fading sun and threw it back toward the hill in sharp, white flashes. I watched from the ground with Walter beside me, his cane planted in the mud, his breath rough but steady. The final panel slid into place just before sunset, and the barn changed shape all at once. It became tall, permanent, impossible to ignore. Then the light hit Marjorie's house. A clean bar of reflected sun ran across her dining room windows, turning them briefly white. A curtain snapped shut. 5 minutes later, Deputy Pike's cruiser came up the drive, moving slow, almost apologetic. Marjorie had called to report an illegal retaliatory structure. Pike stepped out, read June's permit packet on the hood of his cruiser, looked up at the barn, then looked across the fence at Marjorie, standing rigid on her side in pink and fury. He told her it was a lawful agricultural building. Her face did not change at first. Then her mouth tightened, and she looked at the barn the way people look at a locked door from the wrong side. Pike left without writing a citation. Marjorie stayed behind the fence long after the cruiser was gone, staring at the silver roof that had taken the lake from her twice, first by law, then by light. Walter reached for my forearm. His grip was weak, but it was there. He looked up at the barn, at the beams, at the new roof shining where old branches used to move. For the first time since the trees fell, my father smiled. "Your grandfather would have liked this barn," he said. I swallowed hard and kept my eyes on the roof because I did not trust myself to look at him. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Maya, only a photo taken through the clubhouse window after the meeting. Marjorie and Derek stood alone at the head table, arguing over an open laptop. On the screen between them was a county map of my property, and circled in red was the barn. The lawsuit arrived in a white envelope so clean it looked obscene against the mud on our kitchen table. June opened it with a butter knife, read the first page, and laughed once without smiling. Outside the window, the new barn stood silver and silent under a bruised afternoon sky, and across the fence, Marjorie Blake had finally decided she was the victim. She called it a spite structure. She called it malicious obstruction. She claimed my 3-story seed-drying barn had been built for no agricultural purpose, except to punish innocent families in Silver Pine Shores by destroying their lake views. The complaint asked the court to force me to tear it down and pay damages that would have swallowed our farm whole if the paper had been worth the ink on it. June read the filing twice, her face calm, her eyes burning, while Nora stood at the sink gripping a coffee mug with both hands. Walter sat in his chair near the stove, his breathing shallow, his gaze fixed on the barn through the glass, as if he could hold it upright by looking at it. By then, the farm had become 2 different places at once. In daylight, it was work. Caleb and Olivia Hart spent long hours along the exposed boundary, laying straw mulch over raw soil, setting erosion fencing, and planting fast-rooting native cover where the trees had once held the slope together. Olivia moved with quiet certainty, her blonde hair tucked beneath a faded cap, her boots sinking into damp ground, as she corrected runoff channels with a shovel and a level. Caleb followed her drone maps on a tablet, marking water paths, checking sensors, recording everything. I watched them from the barn door one morning, My son kneeling in the dirt beside a woman who did not treat him like a kid or a hired hand. And I realized he was becoming someone I had been too angry to see. In the evenings, the farm became evidence. June built the counterclaim piece by piece across our kitchen table. Permits, seed contracts, storage projections, engineering plans, photographs of equipment bays, invoices for the drying fans, Caleb's solar layout, Nora's habitat records, Warren Ellis's conservation findings, Sam Rodriguez's sworn statement, Maya Chen's video. Every document landed with a dull slap against the wood, and every slap sounded like another nail going into Marjorie's version of the truth. June filed for property destruction, fraud, forgery, trespass, interference with a conservation buffer, and damages tied to the protected habitat. She was supposed to return to Portland that week for a meeting with a firm that had glass walls, city clients, and a salary big enough to make farm debt look small. Instead, she wore my old wool socks around the house and slept 4 hours a night under the same roof she once could not wait to leave. The hidden truth kept spreading uphill. Maya Chen called an unofficial meeting at her house after Marjorie tried to shut down questions in the HOA forum. She expected 10 people. More than 30 came. They stood in Maya's living room, on her stairs, even out on the deck under patio heaters, while she projected HOA budgets onto a white wall. Cascade View Management LLC appeared again and again, quarter after quarter, labeled as vegetation compliance, landscape oversight, environmental maintenance, view preservation. The numbers climbed like mold in a basement. No crew photos, no signed work logs, no real invoices, just money leaving Silverpine and landing near Derek Blake. People who had spent years looking down at my farm began looking at one another instead, realizing they had not only watched a crime happen from their windows, they had paid for the system that made it possible. That was the kind of moment people would argue about in comments. Some would say the whole neighborhood deserved the barn. Some would say fear makes cowards out of good people. I only knew what Maya told Nora later, voice shaking through the phone. By the end of the meeting, 3 residents had cried, 1 had walked out angry, and an old man who had voted for Marjorie 5 times stood by the door whispering that he had been fooled. Marjorie felt that shift. We all did. Her house went dark earlier every night. Derek's car disappeared for long stretches, then returned close to midnight. The pink suits stopped appearing along the fence, but the feeling of being watched never left. Caleb checked the cameras he had installed around the barn twice a day, small black infrared units tucked under eaves, on fence posts, and above the equipment bay. I had thought it was overcautious. Caleb did not argue. He only said people did strange things when the truth cornered them. One evening, while Olivia packed away survey stakes and the sunset turned the barn roof copper, Caleb stood beside me at the open equipment door and admitted something that made me stop moving. He said there had been a time, before the tree cutting, when he thought selling part of the farm might be the only sane future. He thought I was holding the land too tightly, guarding old pain, instead of building anything new. His voice did not accuse me. That made it worse. He looked out at the stumps, the mulch, the young cover crop beginning to green through the dirt, and said he had not understood that memory could be a foundation, not a chain. For a while I could not answer. Then I told him the truth I should have told him years earlier. I had not kept the farm to trap him. I had kept it so he would have something real to choose from. He looked down, nodded once, and Olivia pretended not to hear from 10 feet away, though the softness in her face said she had heard every word. The mistake came that night. At 11:47, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Motion alert, barn, south wall. I sat up before the sound finished, and Nora woke beside me with her hand already on my arm. The camera feed opened in grainy black and silver, sharp enough to show a figure moving across the gravel under the moon. Long coat, gloves, hair pale beneath the hood. For 1 second, I thought the cold had invented her. Then she stepped closer to the wall, and the infrared caught the flash of pink beneath the coat. Marjorie Blake. She carried a spray can in one hand. Her movements were jerky, furious, nothing like the polished woman who had stood at my fence with champagne. She shook the can, glanced toward the farmhouse, and began painting across the lower metal siding in wide, ugly strokes. The words appeared slowly, dripping under the security light. Ugly farm trash. Halfway through, her phone vibrated. She ripped off one glove to answer it, and the camera caught her face full on. White hair, tight mouth, pink lapel, red paint on her fingers. Behind her, the license plate of her Cadillac sat perfectly framed by another camera Caleb had placed near the gate. I did not run outside. That was the hardest part. I sat in the dark with the phone glowing in my hand and let her finish destroying herself. Deputy Pike arrived 18 minutes later. His cruiser lights washed the barn red and blue, turning Marjorie's painted words into something almost bloody. She was already home by then, but not for long. Pike watched Caleb's footage on the tablet, once in silence, then again with his jaw set. By midnight, his cruiser was climbing the hill toward Silverpine Shores. We stood on our porch and watched the lights stop in front of Marjorie's house. A minute later, the front door opened. Marjorie stepped out in the same pink suit, the long coat thrown over it, her face pale under the porch lamp. Pike spoke. She shook her head. Derek appeared behind her, then froze when Pike showed her the still image from Caleb's camera. The handcuffs clicked loud enough in my imagination that I felt them in my chest. At the preliminary hearing, the courtroom was packed with farmers, Silverpine residents, reporters, and people who'd come just to see what kind of woman spray-painted a barn after suing over its appearance. The video played on a large screen. Marjorie's face, Marjorie's plate, Marjorie's pink suit under the coat, Marjorie's bare hand on the phone. The judge watched without changing expression until the clip ended. Then he looked over his glasses and asked whether Mrs. Blake understood that night cameras could also see pink. For the first time since I had met her, Marjorie had no answer. The verdict did not sound like victory at first. It sounded like paper sliding under a judge's hand, like a woman in a pink suit forgetting how to breathe, like 70 people in a courtroom realizing the view they had fought over had never belonged to them. When Marjorie Blake was found guilty, no one cheered, because some damage is too old and too deep to clap for when the law finally catches up. She stood beside her attorney in a pale pink jacket that looked softer than she was, her white hair perfectly shaped, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed through her skin. The charges came one after another: forgery, trespass, destruction of property, conspiracy to defraud the HOA, criminal mischief, and interference tied to the protected conservation buffer. Each word took another piece of the woman who had once stood at my fence line with champagne. Derek Blake did not make it to trial with the same confidence. He pleaded guilty to the Cascade View management fraud before a federal courtroom had the chance to peel him open in public. The company he had used like a private drain pipe was dissolved. The HOA was ordered to open its books, repay stolen fees, contribute to restoration, and rebuild its bylaws from the bones up. Outside the courthouse, the sky over Cedar Hollow was low and silver, the kind of Oregon sky that makes every person look a little more honest. Reporters waited near the steps with cameras raised, hoping I would give them anger, grief, a sentence they could cut into a headline. June stepped between them and us before I had to say a word. She wore a dark coat and boots dusted with farm dirt now, not polished city shoes. That small detail almost broke me more than the verdict. My daughter, who had once run from Mercer Ridge like the land itself had teeth, stood there with a legal folder under her arm and looked ready to fight the whole state if it came for us again. Walter did not speak until we were back at the farm. He sat at the kitchen table with the court order in front of him and Nora beside him, her hand resting gently over his. The barn stood outside the window, silver roof dim in the dusk, no longer looking like retaliation. It looked like something that had survived being misunderstood. Caleb came in from checking the erosion sensors with Olivia, both of them carrying mud on their boots and cold on their faces. Sam Rodriguez parked by the fence and stayed in his truck for nearly 10 minutes before coming inside, as if forgiveness were a door he still did not know how to open. The settlement money could have fixed a lot. It could have paid debt, upgraded equipment, put a new roof on the old farmhouse, and given every one of us a reason to sleep better. I would be lying if I said I did not think about it. But Nora laid her old Habitat folder on the table, the one with student handwriting and faded photographs of nests in the branches, and Walter touched the picture of the tree line with 2 fingers. He said, "My grandfather Samuel had planted trees after a flood because land remembers what people do to it. If we wanted to answer Marjorie properly, we should not answer only with court papers." That was how the Samuel Mercer Living Buffer Fund was born. June handled the legal structure. Nora handled the environmental partnerships. Caleb built the mapping system with Olivia, using drones to identify farms where tree lines had been cut, banks had eroded, or developers had pushed too close to fragile ground. The fund would pay for saplings, soil prep, mulch, labor, fencing, and the first years of care. Not just on our farm, on any small farm that needed a living boundary put back where greed, storms, or carelessness had taken one away. The first check went nowhere outside our own fence. Walter insisted on that. He wanted the first 48 trees planted where the old ones had stood. Spring came late that year. On the morning of the planting, fog lay low over Lake Astor, and the new barn rose behind it like a gray ship half-built from memory. Walter came out before sunrise in his brown jacket, moving slowly with his cane, his body thinner than it had been when the trees fell. For a moment I feared the day would be too much for him. Then he pointed to the northern stake and told Caleb the first tree belonged there, not 6 inches over, not where the drone map said it was most efficient, but where Samuel Mercer had put the first one in 1948. Caleb looked down at his tablet, then at his grandfather, and quietly moved the marker. People started arriving after 7. Nora came with thermoses and gloves. June arrived with a stack of volunteer waivers and a shovel over her shoulder. Olivia brought trays of native starts and kissed Caleb on the cheek so quickly he nearly dropped a bundle of stakes. Sam Rodriguez came with his whole crew, none of them wearing chainsaws, all of them carrying shovels. Then, one by one, Silver Pine residents crossed the boundary from the hill. Not the rich silhouettes behind glass anymore. Real people in boots and jackets, awkward, ashamed, trying to do something useful with their hands. Maya Chen came last, not because she was afraid now, but because she stopped at the fence to look at the empty row before stepping through it. She was the new HOA president. Her apology had arrived a week earlier, printed on official Silver Pine Shores letterhead, signed by 63 households. It did not excuse what happened. It did not pretend everyone had been brave. It said they had been silent too long, and silence had helped the wrong person become powerful. That line made people talk all over town. Some said the HOA deserved worse. Some said the apology mattered. I only knew Maya handed the letter to Walter herself, and my father read it twice before folding it carefully and putting it in his coat pocket. By 9, 48 holes were open in the ground. The trees were small enough to look fragile and brave at the same time. Oregon white oak, ponderosa pine, cottonwood, and a few native shrubs, Nora said, would give birds cover while the canopy grew. Walter walked the line with Caleb on one side and me on the other, stopping at the 7th hole. He held a little white oak sapling in both hands. The root ball was wrapped in damp burlap. His fingers shook against it. "This tree," he said, "would be Ruth's tree, named for my mother, who had once hung wind chimes from the old oak every summer so the house would know when the lake wind changed." No one answered right away. Nora looked down. June wiped her face with her sleeve and pretended it was the cold. Caleb lowered the sapling into the hole like he was placing something sacred into the earth. Walter pressed soil around it with his cane, then with his hands. And for one shining second, he looked less like an old man and more like a boy helping his father plant the future. 2 years passed faster than grief had any right to move. The young trees grew above my shoulder. The barn filled with seed, barley, irrigation gear, and the steady sound of drying fans. Caleb stayed on the farm and turned the restoration work into something no one in Cedar Hollow had seen before. Drones mapping damaged land, Olivia designing recovery plans, small farmers calling from 3 counties away. June never went back to the Portland firm. She opened a little office in town with a hand-painted sign that read, "Agricultural land, conservation, property rights." Nora brought students every spring to walk the buffer and learned that ecology was not theory when someone could cut it down. Marjorie and Derek sold their house to pay what the court ordered and left Cedar Hollow before the second planting season. The family who bought it came down one Saturday with an apple pie and 2 nervous children. The husband looked at the barn, then at the young trees, and said he liked it because it made the place feel real. I laughed for the first time in a long while without feeling guilty about it. That evening, Walter sat in a wooden chair near Ruth's tree, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm wind. The sun dropped behind the barn, and the words Caleb had painted on the south wall caught the last light. Mercer Ridge Farm, rooted since 1948. I stood beside the new row and rested my palm against the narrow trunk of the 7th tree. Its bark was still smooth, still young, still easy to break if the world turned careless again. Walter looked at the leaves moving in the lake wind and asked if they would live. I told him yes. They were coming back. He smiled, small and tired, and said that was enough. And as the wind moved through 48 young trees where there had once been only stumps, I looked across the lake and understood something Marjorie Blake never had. A view can be stolen in a day, but roots come back with witnesses. The lesson is simple. Some things in life may look small to others, but they can carry years of sacrifice, memory, and love. A fence line, an old tree, a family home, or even a quiet promise can mean more than money or status. When someone tries to take what is not theirs, staying calm, standing firm, and trusting the truth can be stronger than anger. In the end, what is rooted in love will always find a way to grow back. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who believes in family, justice, and standing up for what is right. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you and everyone watching.